So good morning, everyone. Welcome to church. And as I say, if you're visiting, it's not usually that weird. But did you just feel that embrace for just a second of what it's like to sit in silence? Just that sense of just this. Could be a little awkward, kind of a little nice. It's just a different thing to what we experienced almost every day. As I said in the video, my name is Alex. If you're visiting, it's great to meet you. We're really glad that you are here. We are in the middle of this series that we called Shift. We thought about the start of the year. We thought about this idea that in a new year, people make resolutions, and often those resolutions are grandiose. It's like, I'm going to learn another language in 6 days. I'm going to read the whole of the Bible before February. I'm going to go to the gym 7 times a day, a week. And there's just this sense of like, I'm going to jump in and change something. And the truth is, as we looked, it very rarely happens. It very rarely happens. Most of our good new habits that we plan to grow into, they just end by February or even earlier. So what we said is this: imagine if God had a plan for our lives where we could grow together on purpose. And we looked at how Jesus did this. The Bible says that Jesus grew intentionally on purpose. He came and lived our life with all our challenges, even though he had this right to be God and to be different. He lived with every single one of our challenges. Grew on purpose. And we are invited into that as well. You and I get to think through this idea of, well, what are our next steps with God? And so for every topic that we're going to look at during this 8-week series, we've done prayer, we've done Bible reading, there's this sense of, well, where are you right now? Because where you are right now is fine. There is no judgment in this place. If you've never picked up the Bible before, and you get to do that for the first time, and that's an amazing adventure. Maybe you've never spoken to God before. You get to do that for the first time, and we're excited for you. But maybe you've been on this journey for a while. Maybe there's a step for you, and we get to explore those different options together. The metaphor that we used was one of driving a car, or even perhaps riding a bike. There's that sense of imagine yourself on this beautiful road. You've got all this space in front of you, and you get to just open the car's engine up. You move from first gear to second gear, because as we decided, only stick shifts. That's the only real way to drive a car. It's just the proper way, and the world has something to teach us as a country on this subject, because everywhere else drives stick, and we're stuck with these awful automatic cars. But just imagine that process of moving from first gear to second gear, and every time you change gear, you have this different sense of power, different sense of the engine working for you. Imagine yourself, maybe you ride a bike and you have that sense of the pedals move too easily after a while, you have too much momentum, so you switch into a higher gear, and then it becomes more difficult, but you get more power for your work. The bike starts to move faster. But today what I want to talk about is that idea of what happens when it gets difficult. What happens when, in terms of our shift language, you need to downshift? What happens when you've been riding up that hill, you're in a high gear, and suddenly the pedals become harder and harder to press? Suddenly there's this sense of, my momentum is disappearing, my rhythm has gone. It feels like I'm about to slow down to the point of inertia, and then the bike will just fall over and I'll look ridiculous as I lie on the floor with my bike on top of me. What happens when life gets difficult? How do you deal with that? And some of you might say right from the start, man, I feel like that. I feel like I'm like that little engine that we read about, that's trying to get up the hill. But actually, my story, it feels like I might not make it all the way up the hill. I just feel exhausted, and I'm not sure what to do about it. Overtiredness, exhaustion are a massive problem for our culture. We have that sense of we're all just so busy all the time. And what do you do when you get there? Because it seems like doing something else won't actually solve the problem, will it? We have to not do something for a while, and maybe that's the key. I got an Apple Watch just before Christmas. It was free. It was a long process to make sure it was free. Sometimes, in case you don't know, telephone companies will offer deals that they don't want to live up to in the end. So at some point, I'd like to say that I have the emotional control to tell you the rage-filled story that preceded when this phone company said your free Apple Watch is going to cost you $500. It was not a pretty picture. It was like one of those things that was my worst moment and best moment together. I'm very proud of the way that I got this thing for free. I'm not proud of some of the things that I said in order to get it for free. I'm not proud of some of the emails and letters that I wrote to make sure this happened. But the first thing I noticed when I put it on was this. Every now and again, the watch will buzz at me, and it will say this. It'll say, take a minute to breathe. Now, my first thought was, I'm not going to do what my watch tells me to do. That's absurd. I'm getting bossed around by everything these days. A watch now wants to say how I live my life. But my second thought was, isn't that nice? Apple is really considerate of my personal well-being. They want my health. They want my good. They're like, I'm looking after you. But the truth is that Apple may have started suggesting people to breathe, but those practices actually go back way, way, way before Apple was ever invented. They're just a new take on something that's been around for a long time. For a long time, God has been very interested in the rhythms that we live by. He has given us rhythms to live by that allow us to live the life that he wants us to live. And when we neglect those, when we move away from those, actually that is one of the things that ends up with us leading to that place of we're in danger. We're in that dangerous, tired spot. God has given us rhythms to live by, and we neglect them at our peril. So today we're going to look at 3 of those rhythms. Now realize when we do this, we'll see some of those rhythms in everyday life. But if you look on the next slide, what I said was this. Practices that may help you find rhythm are both ancient and modern. That idea of breathing that Apple has given you is, again, it's not a new thing. It's a spin on an ancient thing that's been around for ages. There's ways that we're going to look at these different practices, and we're going to find modern ways to live them, but they are, in actual fact, ancient. Every now and again, you see something in this world that is a modern take on something ancient. For a while, if you saw them, people were running in these shoes called Vibram 5 fingers. They were like a sock that you put over your foot. It was designed to mirror barefoot running that people had done centuries and centuries ago. The practice is both new and it's also old. It's both ancient and it's modern. There's ways that we get to live out some of these practices we're going to look at that are both ancient and modern. So this is the first one. The first one is this idea of Sabbath. Early on in the story of the Bible, this group of people escapes from a place called Egypt. It would be fairer to say that they were let go or rescued. It seems like God intervenes in their situation, but in the end, the people of the land said, you know what? We don't want you here anymore. Get out. These plagues take place and the land gets really messy, and it seems that they just say, go on, just go. And so much do they want this group of people out that they actually hand over a significant chunk of gold and stuff just to say, we just want you out of here. But this people has no identity. They don't know who they are, really. They've lived as slaves for hundreds of years. And so they end up at a mountain, and in this incredible situation, God gives them these laws to live by. 10 laws to live by. But to me, the most interesting one is the 5th one that he gives them, which is what we're going to look at today. He tells them this. Next slide. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. As the Lord your God has commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or your daughter, nor any male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, nor any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your town, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath. What an interesting law. Notice the reason that he gives them the law. What he says to them is this: you guys remember what it's like. You guys lived in the land of slavery where every day was the same, where every day you were expected to produce something. You were supposed to make something happen, and you got up and you did that 7 days a week. Don't come out of that land and be given your own land and then do to others what was done to you. That's not the way to live. The one thing that the Sabbath was based on was this, simply this: don't do any work. Stop. Just stop for a whole day. When you think about great laws to give someone to live by, what an incredible thing to say. I just want you to stop. Now, by the time Jesus comes along, loads of things have changed. This thing has become super legalistic. It's become about all the things that you can't do. It's no longer about don't work. It's about just ridiculous, tiny little things. You can't walk a particular distance. You can't turn on a light. You can't make any food. But in its original idea, it was this. It was just this. It was just trust me. Take a day and just stop. Next slide. Sabbath, in the first instance, is not about worship. It's about work stoppage. It's about withdrawal from the anxiety system of Pharaoh and Egypt, the refusal to let one's life be defined by production and consumption and the endless pursuit of private well-being. The truth is that Egypt was simply concerned in what you could produce, what you contributed in that sense. Does that sound like a society that we've started to move to today? That sense of everybody is always busy all the time, always doing something. In some ways, when we're at our worst, we come to reflect that concept of Egypt. We come to reflect that sense of I always have something to do, and every day is like the last. I just feel like I do too much. Next slide. This was Jesus' take on it. As I say, by Jesus' time, it had become this system of legalism. It had become this sense of all the things that you can't do on the Sabbath. It had no longer been that celebration of just stopping from work. It had become a routine. One Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Simply, they were walking in the fields, and as their hands stroked the grains, they pulled some off and put them in their mouths and enjoyed the food. He answered, "Have you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And then he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." He takes them back to this sense. He says to them, look, think about how you're enjoying this day that God has given. You're treating it like God needed you to make the Sabbath work. That was never the way around it was. God gave you this as a gift. And when he said, don't work on it, he said, not don't do it to impress me. He said, this thing is good for you. Now, what you're going to find as we look at these different practices that we're going to look at today is actually, these are really hard to do. And they're not really hard to do because God asks you to do something difficult. They're really hard to do because he asks you to trust him and to not do something. And for us in our society to not do something can actually be far, far harder. When we trust God in that way, what we do is this. We say, I believe that you know more than I do. When we insist on working on Sabbath, not taking a day, what we say is this, God, I know better than you do. I don't need this. I am just fine. Every single one of these practices we're going to look at, they are counterintuitive because it seems the opposite to the culture that we have. And that culture, in truth, is hard to overcome. There's a writer based in Silicon Valley called Alex Soo-Young Kim. And what he says is this. In today's culture, overwork is celebrated. He tells a story of an executive that he happened to come across. And this man had set his email to send emails out at 2 o'clock in the morning, even though he'd written them at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He wasn't concerned that sending emails at 2 o'clock in the morning would make him look weird. He was concerned that not sending them at 2 o'clock in the morning would make him look lazy. Do you see how twisted a society is that celebrates overwork to that degree? It says there's always more that you can reduce, always more that you can give. Now, this doesn't mean that we take away the value of working hard. Working hard is this important thing. What it does say is there are limits, and there's times where you have to get to a point of saying, I can't do any more. Next slide. Sometimes this will cost you. This is a group of toy chains in the UK. It's called The Entertainer. They have about 56 stores around the country. And the man who started it is a Christian. He loves the ways following Jesus. And he wanted to make sure that his stores reflected that ability to follow Jesus well as well. So what he said is this, I will never ever open on a Sunday. Now think about that. Sunday is the second busiest day of the year, of the week. It's the way, people are foot trafficking, people are coming through. If you're going to open, surely Sunday is a good day to open. But he said, no, I firmly believe that Sunday is a day not to open. He's lost millions of dollars from his 56 stores by making that super difficult decision. But it's actually more interesting than that as well. This particular picture was taken in my hometown of Solihull. At the mall in Solihull, it's a 7-day-a-week mall. If you choose not to open on any day, you have to pay a fine to stay shut. $1,000, £1,000 a week, just to stay shut on one particular day. What he's chosen to say is this. The concept of Sabbath and rest is so important to me. Not only am I willing to lose the money that I would have made, I'm willing to pay additional money to make sure that I follow it. To us, that seems counterintuitive, but what he's saying is this, I'm going to trust God that he knows better than I do. I'm going to trust God and say that I'm not going to have to force anybody to come in on Sunday. I'm going to stay closed because that is my principle. Is that extreme? Yes. Do you have to do that? No. But what he's done is found a way to make the Sabbath work for him in a modern sense. We get invited into this incredible gift of Sabbath, and it is so necessary. But it was never intended to be legalistic. In actual fact, this is supposed to be a gift of joy. Think about all the things that you could do on a Sabbath. There's this author called Wayne Mueller that writes a book on Sabbath, and he starts his Sabbath with this idea. You close work the day before. It's 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. Whatever didn't get done, won't get done now. Shut the books. He says, sit, cook some food with some friends that you love, choose ingredients that mean a lot to you. Take a candle and light it and spend a second gazing at it. Simply take a moment to rest. And when I first read that at a time in my life when I was particularly busy, there was a sense that I almost cried as I read it. Because nothing in my life was as gentle as that. There's something about seeing a life lived well that says, that's exactly the rhythm I'm supposed to be finding. doing Sabbath will take some work for you if you choose to enter into it. You might have to choose to do that as a family because we are so busy. There's sporting events to get to, the school activities to get to, there's everything. To make Sabbath a principle for you is one of the hardest things you can do. But what you see is there's these moments of like, that is amazing. Sabbath is this first rhythm that God invites us into, and what he says is this: Sabbath is about resting yourself, and it's about acknowledging that the world will survive without you for just a day. But there's another one. Second one is this sense of solitude. It's this sense of getting away, not just from work, but from everything that your life is centered on. Now, can you do this for a day? Probably not. Most of us have responsibilities that just won't allow that. But finding solitude has just for a long time been this practice that people have found to give life to them. Look at the start of Jesus' ministry. This is what he chooses to do. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Jesus' first thing he does is leave. He's got all these people around him, all these people that he could help, and he takes a month and more to just go, to just leave. 40 days out in the wilderness. Now, this wasn't a particularly new idea at all. There were loads of spiritual people in Jesus' day that spent all of their time in the wilderness. They believed that the best way to deal with humanity and its mess was just to get away from it. People are bad. What I can do is I can leave, and God will judge them, and that will be great. So Jesus, in his first thing, looks like he's actually doing something similar. He gets up and he leaves. But Jesus goes and he collects something there and takes it back with him. He doesn't leave for good. There's something about his time, 40 days alone, away from people, that prepares him for everything that he's going to do afterwards. What's really interesting as you track Jesus' ministry, if you read the Bible, read the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John stories, almost every incredible thing that Jesus did starts with something like this. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Almost every single story has that narrative right before it. Jesus chose to go and get away from people. Now, depending on your personality, that either sounds like heaven or like hell. The idea of being alone for some of us is sheer torment. Think about it for a second. I'll paint you a picture. You're in a cabin. There's no internet. There's just maybe a book, maybe one or two. You've got some coffee. You've got some warmth, some heat. And you've got a chair. And you get to sit. And it's quiet. Not just quiet for a little while, quiet for a long period of time. Now, depending on your personality, this moment is either loneliness or it's solitude. Now, I know that there's loads of mothers and fathers of small kids that are like, oh, I can tell you which it is. This moment is a dream because it never happens. But when you're making a choice, this moment of sitting here, the thing that is definitely true is you're alone. It is solitude. But the loneliness is just simply a perspective. Are you lonely when you sit like this? Or are you alone? Those are two very different things. We get to choose to move away from everything around us for just a while. I'm not talking just people. I'm talking about the constant buzz of a phone that says, do you know what? You need to respond to me right now. Quite regularly, we talk on FaceTime with my parents back in England. And I will be speaking to my mother. She's talking to her grandkids, and she loves doing that. It's one of her favorite things. And the house phone will ring, and she'll say to me, I've just got to answer the phone. I'm like, Mom, it is nobody important. It's certainly no one more important than us who you're talking to right now. You get to opt out of that, but there's something about the way she's wired that says, I just can't let it ring. And something about it says, no, you have to answer it. Solitude is this choice that we make to say no to some of those things. I just finished watching this series about the life of affluent Jewish people in New York in the 1950s. And it seems that just not far from here, in this place that was called the Borscht Belt, down by the Catskills, many, many affluent Jewish people who lived in the cities would have this sense of, for the summer, we're going to get away. We're just going to leave the city because it's intolerable in the summer, So here we go. And you can find these incredible places that they went to stay, these places up in the mountains that just had everything that you could possibly imagine. Whole communities of people got up and moved from one place to another just to spend 3 months just by a lake where it was quiet, where there was air, because they realized that in the city, there was none of those things. Now, over time, as Jewish people acclimatized to New York and became part of the overall society, as air conditioning came in and you realized that you could get the coolness of the mountains in your apartment, and air travel became cheaper, people started flying different places, these places became super dilapidated. And you can see, like, that's the same place, just fallen apart. But what they knew instinctively was this: getting away from things is a super important thing to do. You and I have to find ways to incorporate solitude into our lives. Does it have to be for a day? No, of course it doesn't, because for most of us that's impossible. But finding just a few minutes to do that every day may actually be the answer to that loss of rhythm in your life. We get to say no to things just as a decision. You can say no to some of the things in your life. The Sabbath, the solitude, but something else that solitude creates a space for is maybe the hardest of them all. It's this idea of silence. In 1992, the Super Bowl had the worst halftime show of all time. It was known as the Winter Wonder Show, and 22 million people turned over the channel during the halftime show. It was a disaster. Nobody was watching. They lost a huge chunk to a different station just because they would watch anything that wasn't this. So the organizers of the Super Bowl went back and said, we've got to do something next year. We've got to create some kind of incredible event. So they went and they hired the most iconic pop star they could possibly find. They went and hired this guy. And as Super Bowl 1993 took place at the halftime show, there's this moment where there's this explosion, and suddenly Michael Jackson, the king of pop, appears on top of the Jumbotron over one side of the stadium. There's a second explosion, and Michael Jackson appears over the other side of the stadium on top of the Jumbotron. And then a third explosion, and a trapdoor opens in the stage, and Michael Jackson's fired 6 feet up in the air and lands in the middle of the stage. I've asked every church that I've worked at, can I do this at some point for a sermon? And every time they say no. And then, as he lands in this pose, he stops and he does nothing for 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Just 2 minutes, 20 seconds of silence. He moves his head once and the crowd goes nuts. But he knows instinctively that in 30 years, people will be talking about 2 minutes of silence long after they've forgotten which set he did, which songs he did, long after they've forgotten elements of his performance. He knows that silence in those moments is groundbreaking. He's taken the most valuable 12 minutes of television and used 2 of them to do nothing. Silence has this power that we often don't realize. In 1940, the British war effort was going disastrously. This was before you guys came in and bailed us out for the second time in 30 years. And the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was going to be forced to retire. He wanted a particular person to replace him, this guy called Lord Halifax. But there was a problem. There was this guy called Churchill who was pretty popular in some places. And Churchill was a natural successor in some ways. And so they decided to get Churchill on board. They invited him into the equivalent of the Oval Office in 10 Downing Street. And they said, Winston, we would like you to consider supporting Lord Halifax as Prime Minister. Churchill has a problem with this. Not necessarily just that he wants to become Prime Minister. His problem is that he knows that Chamberlain has appeased Hitler for years coming up to the war effort. He'll do everything he can just to say, let's have some peace. He won't do what's necessary. And he knows Halifax is exactly like Churchill. So he has a problem. If he says yes, then what happens? Britain gets the Prime Minister it exactly doesn't need. But what happens if he says no? How can you be in the middle of a war and not look like a team player? This is a national crisis. How can you say, no, I'm going to play politics. I'm not going to support the Prime Minister. I'm going to fight against him. He can't do that either. There's no yes option and there's no option. So what Churchill does is this. He wanders over to the window and he spends the next 3 to 4 minutes just staring out the window. Refuses to answer the question. Won't deal with them at all. And it's this kind of moment of who's going to crack first? And finally, Halifax kind of rubs his hair and he says, do you know what? I think we've gone past a time where a lord, a member of the aristocracy, can be Prime Minister. Churchill, maybe you should do it. And Churchill turns around and says, that sounds like a great idea to me as well. It's these moments where silence is actually more powerful than anything else that we can do. The problem is that we're doers. So silence, again, is counterintuitive to us. But when you choose to embrace silence as part of solitude, something magical can happen. This is a story of Elijah. Elijah's what's called a non-writing prophet. In the Old Testament, there's prophets that wrote down words, and there's prophets that didn't. Someone else recorded their history. So this is one of the non-writing prophets. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. In this story, Elijah has just had the best moment of his life. His main antagonist during his prophet career was this guy called Ahab and his wife called Jezebel. If you've heard the phrase, she's such a Jezebel, this is who the phrase comes from. Jezebel was this nasty piece of work. She was just really awful. Long ago, the people of Israel had been told, don't marry people from other nations. They'll take their gods, they'll bring them here, they'll mess up your society, they'll have you doing things God has told you not to do. For example, almost every other society in that area that sacrificed children. The Israelites were pretty unusual in that. So they said, don't marry into these other societies. Stay away from them. Ahab doesn't listen, and he brings in this woman called Jezebel, and society becomes a disaster. And Elijah is that lone voice that's standing up against them. And in this one showdown moment, he invites all the prophets of this other god, this guy called Baal, and says, come to this mountain. We're going to build an altar. We're going to put something on it. We're not going to light it. We're not going to burn it. We're going to call down fire from heaven. And the God who answers by fire will say he's the real God. So in this moment, these 450 priests of Baal chant and they cheer and they just ask for something to happen. And Elijah stands there and he makes fun of them. He's like, maybe your God is in the bathroom. Maybe he's indisposed. This is actually legitimately what he says to them. He's mocking them as they're chanting and asking for fire and nothing happens. And then it's Elijah's turn and he says, grab some water. I want you to tip it on the altar. I want you to make it as wet as possible. We're going to make this as difficult as possible for God to answer. And then in this moment, Elijah stands, this quiet old figure by himself, and he prays and he asks that God would show himself to be the real God. And in that moment, this fire falls from heaven and the altar goes poof. Think about how that affects the hearts and minds of the people watching. Suddenly you've got these 450 people that have said that, no, we're going to worship this other God who's just a statue. And suddenly they see fire from heaven. And 450 prophets of Baal are killed by Elijah. It's not a story we always know how to deal with. Like, did you have to kill them? Could you not just kick them out of the country or take away their robes or something like that? Or could you not take their credentials off them so they can't, run services anymore? But they all die. And then Elijah has this moment where he realizes what he's done. He has this moment where suddenly he's out of the excitement of the moment. He says, man, I'm in trouble. Jezebel gives this promise. She says, may the crows have my body for sport if Elijah is not dead by tomorrow. And so Elijah does this. He gets up and he runs. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. While he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. He has his solitude, but there's something else that he needs, because Elijah at this point, I think, still just won't shut up. He still thinks he is the solution to the problem. Look what happens next. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. This moment of stillness. when it gets super quiet. These big spectacular things happen, and then there's this moment, just shh. The Hebrew phrase there is this word quel damama de qua. It's this sense of, yes, it could be a gentle stillness, it could be Simon and Garfunkel's sound of silence. It's almost got this sense of a thin whisper. Next slide. The quel damama de qua, sound of a gentle whisper, a thin stillness, I think is on the next slide. Click onto the next slide. A thin silence. For centuries past in Celtic spirituality, they've referred to these ideas of thin spaces. They believed, for whatever reason, that the gap between the spiritual world and the physical world was exactly 3 feet. Don't know why they thought that, nobody quite knows, but we'll go with them on it for now because we don't know any better. But they had this sense of, do you know, have you ever been in one of those places where something seems like a holier place? There's just this sense of, wow, this is incredible. There's a picture here of a place in England that's actually called Holy Island that is one of those. It's that sense of just, I get here and it just has this feeling to it. Now, I don't know if there's anything to it. I certainly don't think that the space between the spiritual world and the physical world is 3 feet. That just seems very arbitrary. I can't imagine why it would be that. But I've been in spaces where I feel like, wow, it feels like God is here in a particular way. But the times that that's happened most for me have not been times where I've been in any particular place. It's been times where I've allowed myself to embrace this idea of silence. That God wasn't in the earthquake. He wasn't in the fire. He was in that moment of gentle stillness. Where everything gets quiet. Everything gets thin. There's that sense of, I no longer feel I am responsible for everything being right in the world. Suddenly I'm not praying and asking for things. Suddenly I'm relying on this God who knows more than I do, that is in control, and that the best thing I can do is sit and be quiet. Next slide. This is a quote from, that I think I've quoted for you before. It's from a guy called Brennan Manning. He's a contemplative prayer guy, and what he said is this: the hour you spend in the prayer room is when you refocus, recenter on Jesus, becoming fully aware of his presence once again. When this happens, you carry God's presence with you into the other 23 hours of the day, knowing all the time that he is with you, he is for you, he likes you, and he hears your thoughts. You'll see people and situations the way he sees them. When problems arise, you'll pray in real time, right then and there, instead of compiling prayer lists for a later, holier moment. In fact, your life will become that moment, a continual conversation with God. That's what silence invites us into. Sabbath gives us rest. Solitude removes us from the situation, but silence gives us that sense of God is here with me now. There's this sense, I believe, that God doesn't ever force himself on anybody. What he does is he waits for us to move towards him before he moves in return. He's made that one big eternal move. We know that he came down, and in Jesus he was present in this world in a particular way, but now he waits for us to take that step back in return. And solitude, silence, gives us that sense of like, God, I want to become aware of your presence, maybe for the first time ever in my life. So how do we do that? This is Psalm 23. It's a super famous psalm, but it has something really interesting to it that I think helps us. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. The word for soul in Hebrew is this word nephesh. It means your lifeblood, your soul. It could mean lots of different things. But one of the elements that it actually has is like this sense of breath. This idea that I talked about, that Apple kind of encouraged me to do all the time, this breathing thing. It starts maybe with that sense of, you know what, I'm just going to breathe. And realize that something I take for granted all the time. That God has given me this breath to quieten down. Not saying anything. When it talks about God creating the world, the picture it gives you is this 6 days that's like an inhale. And then finally there's this sense of like, 7th day, it's done. The breath releases. We're invited into this silence thing, and maybe the first thing for you to do is sit and just breathe for a second. To realize that God is here with us. He loves loves us. He is for you. Maybe it's the first time you've ever experienced God. And that's okay. Maybe you've done that multiple times. Maybe you've come in with that sense of heaviness that I talked about at the start, the sense that life is just too busy. There's just too much going on. You take a breath. You don't say anything. You just realize that God knows more than you. In solitude, what we realize is this. In silence, what we realize is this. You get to realign yourself with who God is. And you realize that you will survive without you for a minute. You don't have to fix everything. In Sabbath, we realize the world will survive without us. In solitude, we realize that people will survive without us. And in silence, we realize that we will be okay without us fixing everything. That is what we're invited into. So I'm going to invite the band guys to come back on stage. Mike and Josh, if you would come up. We're going to close with a song, but for a second, we're just going to do this thing where we're going to call it Encounter. And I'm just going to ask you to close your eyes with me a second. If you don't want to, that's fine. You don't have to. I'm just going to invite you into it. Maybe you don't know God in the way that you'd like to. We believe as a church that everyone is invited into a relationship with this Jesus person, who is God living amongst us, who loved us enough to die for us, gave his everything for us, and now invites us to a better way of living with him in this world today. Maybe you've never, ever done that. Maybe that's a new step for you. In this moment of just closing eyes and breathing together, you get to invite that God into your life. Maybe that's just a word of just saying, Jesus, I would like to live my life with you. Sorry for the way I've lived it without you. But then maybe it's just this sense of stillness. Just realizing that you don't have to fix all the problems. This week, as you respond to the sermon, there will be hard decisions to make. I would encourage you to make one hard decision, whether it's Sabbath, solitude, or silence. One thing that's difficult, that's not easy. And it's not easy because you're not doing something instead of doing something. Maybe God in this moment speaks to you and he gives you that one thing. He says, I want you to find a way to do this. Maybe you need to learn to take a day. Maybe you need to learn to take an hour. Maybe you need to learn to take a minute. But in some ways, each of us has a thing to do. In this moment, God, I ask that you would speak to us. Shape our lives around you. Thank you for the rhythms that you've given us to life. We don't have to answer the world's problems. We're not the answer to people's problems. We're not even the answer to our own problems. Ultimately, you ask us to trust that you know more than we do. When you said we can take a day, you meant it, even if it's hard to do. When you told us to get away and escape from the noise of the world, to put down the phone, you did it for our good. And when you told us to stop talking and accept that you know more than we do, you open us up to this world where we're no longer reliant on ourselves, and that we just become aware of you. God, we are grateful for the way that you love us. So guys, just take a second just to enjoy that stillness, that silence. And Josh and Mike are going to lead us in one of the songs we sang earlier, just whenever they feel ready. But this is a moment for you to rest. Maybe as you realize God's call on you to rest, that weight starts to lift and you start to feel better. Maybe there's some tears that start to fall because you're like, there's that relief. Maybe the mountain doesn't feel quite as high as it did before. The pedals feel a little lighter. Maybe there's that sense that someone is on your side, someone is rooting for you. Someone that loves you more than you'll ever love yourself. God, thank you that you're present with us.